I chose Psalm 141 as our reading for today, particularly because the writer in his prayer asks God for two things. First, he asks for help to prevent him from doing evil, and secondly, he asks God to protect him from others doing evil to him, which I thought provided a good lead-in to this week's line of the Lord's Prayer. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil, or from the evil one. Well, simple enough, we may think, and it's absolutely fine to see the prayer, understand it in that way. Keep us from doing evil and protect us from evil. Or as one Bible translation puts it, keep us safe from ourselves and the devil. I rather like that interpretation. But actually, once you start studying the sentence in detail, or even just reading a few different Bible translations, you realise there are some slightly different ways of looking at it, but all of which end up connecting together, I think, under the general theme of asking for God's protection. One way of looking at things is to consider it all being to do with temptation, and that having prayed in the previous line of the prayer for God to forgive us for the things we've done wrong in the past, now we're praying that he will help us not to do wrong in the future. Follows on nicely. And this interpretation makes sense, because when you look in the Bible to find out where temptation to do wrong comes from, you can find two different answers. Sometimes we read that temptation comes from our own evil desires, from the selfish side of our nature. At other times we read that temptation comes from the devil, that it's he who puts it into our minds. Jesus, we know, was tempted by the devil. And whether these two sources of temptation work independently of each other, or whether they operate together, I'm not sure. But it does mean that the whole line of this prayer could be to do with temptation, the temptation to do wrong, including that request for protection from evil. On the other hand, the whole line of this prayer could be interpreted as being to do with testing rather than temptation. In other words, how we react in testing times, difficult times, maybe when we're suffering in some way. Some versions of the Bible view it this way. For example, the Good News Bible says, "Do not bring us to hard testing, but save us from the evil one." And interestingly, in the Bible, this kind of testing, rather like temptation, on different occasions is said to come from different sources. In this case, it's either from Satan or from God. Of course, other people can be implicated as well as the agents through which either God or Satan work. You may know the story of Job in the Old Testament, who was hit by a series of awful tragedies, loss of property and loss of lives among members of his family. These things were attributed to the devil, who was trying to destroy Job's faith in this way. He failed, by the way, in case you don't know. But on other occasions, God is said to test his followers, leading them into difficulty, but so that their faith may be strengthened by the experience. And there is a great promise that comes along with that God will give us the strength to endure any such testing. Some troubles in life are, of course, a result of the actions of sinful human beings who can be rightly blamed for some suffering. But we still find ourselves with the question, I think, is it God or is it the devil who is behind this? We have it all very well illustrated in the death of Jesus on the cross. Was it mankind's doing? Was it Satan's doing? Or was it God's doing? And you will be able to find verses in the Bible to support any and all of those views. And here it really does seem as if, in different ways, all are true. And we face these same dilemmas, don't we, as Christians? And the solution, I think, certainly over the question of is it God or is it the devil testing us, is to take our focus away from actually asking where is the problem coming from and ask instead, what am I going to do now that the problem is here? While believing what is made very clear in the Bible, that in every situation, whether it's to do with temptation or testing, that God is always working for good and what is good for us, whereas the devil is always working for evil and against God. And believing too that if we trust in God, if we call out to him, then his good intentions are the ones which will win out, because he is far more powerful than Satan. Here's a little illustration of what I'm thinking about. It's from a guy called J. John, who's talking about testing in the positive sense from God and contrasting that to temptation, which is from the devil. Here's what he writes. Let's take a hypothetical case. Ruth's aging and argumentative mother comes to stay with her for 2 weeks. Ruth needs to talk some things through with her mum, but faces the challenge of staying calm and not having a blazing row with her. From God's point of view, these 2 weeks are a test for Ruth, so that through it her faith will be strengthened and matured. You could easily envisage that if all goes well, she may be able to say, I really learned a lot about being patient when Mum came to stay. It was only the power, presence and the peace of the Holy Spirit that enabled me to get through. From the devil's point of view, however, these 2 weeks offer the opportunity not of testing, but of tempting. If he can get Ruth to snap at her mother and have an almighty row, then he has won a victory. What Ruth faces, therefore, is both a test and a temptation. If she manages to love her mother through this difficult fortnight, then Ruth will look back on this as a test that she successfully passed and one in which her faith grew. If, on the other hand, she gives in to anger and bitterness, she will look back on this as a temptation that she gave into. You know, I think as we think about the virus which is afflicting our world, we can approach it in a similar way. Because on a practical level, we might start by asking if the pandemic is simply an unavoidable hazard of living in our world with no one really to blame, or is it due to human recklessness, perhaps from playing about with viruses in a laboratory? And of course, that's something we can investigate and maybe do something about. But, you know, beyond that, there's still that question, isn't there? Should we be attributing this ultimately to God's action or to the devil? Some have said it's more than a test, it's actually a punishment from God. Well, I don't have much time for that idea, I have to say. I mean, even when we do read in the Bible of God punishing groups of people in some way, it's always a very targeted action and it's made very clear why it's happening, even with advance warnings. So I'd say no to that. Is God testing us in some way? Is that a valid way of seeing things? Well, it's hard to get your head around that one, isn't it? Some say it's from the devil, that such a dreadful thing must be. Is that true? Well, in some sense, it may be. But you know what? I just don't find these questions helpful. I mean, there may be occasions when we can justifiably say that the problems we face in life have come directly from either God or from the devil. And that might be helpful sometimes. But most of the time, that question is unanswerable. And trying to answer it is simply not helpful. The much more important question to ask, I think, is what am I going to do now that this challenge has presented itself? Who am I going to turn to? Who am I going to trust while times are tough? Remembering again that in any testing situation, God will be working with good intentions, the devil will be working with evil intentions. God will be using our suffering to draw us closer to him and strengthen our faith. Satan will be using it to try and push us away from God and weaken our faith. God will be using it to increase our love for one another as we care for each other in tough times. The devil will be using it to try and divide us and set us against each other. Who are we going to let guide our thinking and our acting? That's the vital question in times like this. We must recognize too that God will not keep us from all physical harm in life. Though of course we can and should pray for that. And such prayers can and do sometimes bring about some amazing results. And we should always do whatever we can practically to minimize suffering. We don't just sit back and let God do it all for us. So in the case of coronavirus, we stay at home as much as we can, we accept the vaccine if we're eligible, and we care for one another. But in the thick of our troubles, if we cry out to God, we do have some guarantees, some wonderful promises from God, that he will always be with us, that he will give us the strength to endure any pain that does come, and that he will keep us absolutely safe in our relationship with him, our eternal relationship with him. As the verse says, which we began our service with, he is the guardian of our souls. Well, we're going to close with another song. It's The Lord's My Shepherd. And I hope we can use it as our prayer in response to what we've been thinking about today. As we say that our desire and our commitment is to trust in God in everything.